Have you ever been alone at night near water? That feeling when every small splash makes your heart beat faster. When the darkness seems alive? Well, what if I told you that feeling exists for a reason? What if I told you that sometimes, just sometimes, there really is something watching you from the dark water? Tonight I'm going to share 5 real stories. 5 true nightmares that happen to regular people just like you and me. These people went fishing for fun. They went fishing to relax. But what they found in the water changed their lives forever. And I promise you, after hearing these stories, you will never look at fishing the same way again. Story 1. The Monster of Lake Superior. David Thompson was just a regular guy. He worked as an electrician in a small town in Minnesota. He had a wife, 2 kids, and a small boat that he loved more than his truck. For 20 years, every weekend, David would take his boat out on Lake Superior to fish. He knew every spot where the fish liked to hide. He knew every rock, every current, every secret place where the big ones lived. But Lake Superior is not a normal lake. It's huge, it's deep, and it's cold. So cold that dead bodies don't rot. They just sink to the bottom and stay there forever, perfectly preserved in the icy darkness. The Native Americans who lived there first called it the lake that never gives up its dead. And on one October morning in 2019, David learned why. It started as a perfect day. David woke up at 4 a.m, just like always. He made his coffee, black with no sugar, just like always. He loaded his boat with his fishing gear, his lunch, and his old radio that only got 3 stations. The weather report said it would be calm and sunny, perfect for catching lake trout. David drove to the boat launch as the sun was starting to come up. The lake was like glass, smooth and still. Not a single wave. He put his boat in the water and started the motor. It coughed once, twice, then started running smooth. David smiled. It was going to be a good day. He drove his boat out about 3 miles from shore. This was his secret spot. Not many people knew about it, but there was an underwater cliff here where the big fish liked to hunt. David had caught his biggest fish ever at this spot. A 40-pound lake trout that fought for 20 minutes before he could bring it in. As David was setting up his fishing rods, something strange happened. A thick fog rolled in from nowhere. 1 minute the sky was clear, the next minute David couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. Now fog on Lake Superior is normal, but this fog was different. It was thick like soup, and it was cold, so cold that David could see his breath even though it was supposed to be a warm morning. David wasn't worried. He had fished in fog before. He had a GPS on his boat and a compass as backup. He knew exactly where he was. So he kept setting up his fishing lines, humming an old song his dad used to sing. That's when he heard the first splash. It wasn't a normal splash, not like a fish jumping or a bird diving. This was big, like someone had dropped a refrigerator in the water. The splash was so big that waves rocked David's boat, making him grab the side to keep from falling. David looked around but couldn't see anything through the fog. The water had gone still again. Dead still. Even the small waves that are always on the lake had stopped. It was like the whole lake was holding its breath. Then something hit the bottom of David's boat. Hard. The whole boat lifted up out of the water for a second, then crashed back down. David fell to his knees, his coffee mug flying overboard. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might explode. In 20 years of fishing, nothing had ever hit his boat like that. David scrambled to grab his spotlight. It was a powerful light he used for night fishing. He turned it on and pointed it at the water. The beam of light cut through the fog, but he could only see about 2 feet down into the dark water. But in those 2 feet, David saw something that made his blood turn to ice water. Scales. Huge scales. Each one was as big as a dinner plate. They were dark green, almost black, and they were moving. Something massive was swimming right under his boat. David had seen every kind of fish in Lake Superior. He knew that sturgeons could grow to be 6 feet long. He knew that muskies could get pretty big, too. But this was something else. This was impossible. The thing kept swimming past his boat. David counted the seconds. 5, 10, 15, 20. The creature was still passing under his boat. Whatever this thing was, it had to be at least 30 feet long. Maybe longer. Then it stopped. The water went completely still. The fog seemed to get thicker, pressing in on David from all sides. He couldn't hear anything. No birds, no waves, not even the sound of his own breathing. It was like the whole world had gone silent. David's hands were shaking as he reached for his boat motor. He needed to get out of there. Now. But just as his fingers touched the key, the water in front of his boat started to bubble. Something was coming up. The smell hit David first. It was horrible, like 100 dead fish left in the sun for a week, like rotten eggs mixed with sewage. David gagged and covered his nose with his shirt, but the smell got through anyway. Then he saw it. A head rose out of the water, but it wasn't like any fish head David had ever seen. This head was the size of a garbage can. It had skin like a snake, dark and slimy. Pieces of dead plants hung from it like a beard. But the worst part was the eyes. The eyes were huge. Each one was as big as a basketball. They were white and milky, like the eyes of a dead fish. But these eyes were looking right at David. They were smart eyes, thinking eyes, hungry eyes. The creature rose higher out of the water. Its neck was as thick as a tree trunk. Water poured off its body like a waterfall. The smell got worse. David could see its mouth now. It was closed, but he could see the outline of teeth underneath the skin. Lots and lots of teeth. David and the monster stared at each other. Time seemed to stop. David couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't even blink. All he could do was stare into those huge white eyes. Then the creature opened its mouth. The smell that came out was so bad that David threw up right there in his boat. Inside the creature's mouth, he could see rows and rows of teeth. They were like knives, curved backward toward its throat. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was stuck between those teeth. David could see pieces of things. A fishing net tangled in the back teeth. What looked like part of a life jacket. A boat cushion. And was that a shoe? A human shoe? That's when David's body finally started working again. He grabbed the pull cord for his motor and yanked it as hard as he could. The motor coughed but didn't start. The creature tilted its huge head, like a dog listening to a strange sound. It seemed curious about what David was doing. David pulled the cord again. Nothing. The creature lowered its head until it was only a few feet from David's boat. He could see deep into its throat now. It was black in there. Black and endless. Please, 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 David whispered, pulling the cord again and again. On the 5th try, the motor roared to life. David slammed the throttle all the way forward. The boat jumped forward so fast that David almost fell out the back. Behind him he heard a splash as the creature's head crashed down where his boat had just been, but David didn't look back. He kept that throttle wide open, driving blind through the fog. He didn't care where he was going. He just needed to get away from that thing. Behind him, he could hear it following. The splashing was getting closer. Whatever that creature was, it was fast. Very fast. David's boat could go about 35 miles per hour, and the thing was keeping up. David drove in a straight line, praying he was heading toward shore and not further out into the lake. The splashing behind him was getting closer. He could hear the creature's breathing now, a sound like wind in a cave. Then David saw something that gave him hope. The fog was getting thinner. He could see further ahead, and there, in the distance, was the harbor lighthouse. David turned the boat toward the lighthouse and pushed the motor as hard as it would go. Black smoke started coming from the engine, but David didn't care. He just needed to make it to shallow water where that thing couldn't follow. The splashing behind him was right on his tail now. David could feel the creature's breath on his back, cold and wet and smelling like death. Any second, those teeth would close on his boat. Then suddenly, the splashing stopped. David risked a look back. The creature had stopped at the edge of the shallow water. It was watching him with those milky white eyes. As David watched, it slowly sank back into the dark water and disappeared. David made it to the dock and tied up his boat with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He sat in his truck for an hour, trying to understand what had just happened. Part of him wanted to believe it had been a dream or a hallucination, but the smell was still in his clothes, and when he looked at his boat, he found proof that it had been real. There were marks on the bottom of his boat, deep scratches in the aluminum, like something with claws had grabbed it, and stuck in one of those scratches was a tooth. It was 6 inches long, curved like a sword, and sharp enough to cut paper. David kept that tooth. He showed it to a few people, but nobody believed his story. They said he must have hit a log or something. The tooth must be from a dead shark that somehow ended up in the lake. But David knew the truth. He sold his boat the next week. He moved to Arizona, to the desert, as far from water as he could get. He never fished again, but sometimes, late at night, he still dreams about those white eyes watching him from the black water. And he wonders how many other fishermen have seen those eyes. How many didn't make it back to tell their story? Because if something like that lives in Lake Superior, what else is down there? What other monsters are we sharing our lakes and rivers with? And why do they let some people escape while others disappear forever? David doesn't want to know the answers. He just wants to forget. But you can't forget eyes like that. You can't forget the smell. And you can't forget the feeling of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. Story 2. The Midnight Pier. Sarah Chen was young and smart. She was 23 years old and studying to be a marine biologist. That means she was learning about fish and other things that live in the ocean. Sarah loved the ocean. She loved how mysterious it was, how much we still didn't know about it. For her college project, she needed to study what fish do at night. Do they sleep? Do they hunt? Do they act different when the sun goes down? To find out, Sarah spent many nights alone on different piers and beaches, watching and taking notes. She wasn't scared of being alone at night. She had pepper spray in her pocket and a knife in her backpack. Besides, the worst thing she had ever encountered was a drunk fisherman who wanted to tell her his life story. But on a hot July night in 2021, on an old broken pier in North Carolina, Sarah learned that sometimes the ocean keeps secrets for a reason. Sometimes it's better not to know what comes out of the water when the moon is high. The pier was called Blackwood Pier. It was about 20 miles from the nearest town, at the end of a dirt road that most people didn't even know existed. The pier used to be popular with fishermen, but a hurricane had damaged it badly 5 years ago. Now, half the boards were missing, the railings were broken, and the county had put up signs saying, "Danger, keep out." But Sarah wasn't worried about broken boards. She was careful, and besides, the lack of people meant the fish weren't scared away. It was the perfect place to study natural fish behavior. Sarah parked her old Honda at the empty parking lot at 11 at night. She grabbed her backpack full of equipment, notebooks, cameras, measuring tools, and her fishing rod. She also brought a thermos of coffee and some sandwiches. It was going to be a long night. The walk to the end of the pier took about 10 minutes. Sarah had to watch where she stepped because some boards were loose and others were missing completely. Below her, she could hear the ocean waves hitting the pier's legs. The sound was peaceful, like the ocean was breathing slowly in its sleep. Sarah set up her equipment at the very end of the pier. This was the most dangerous part because the hurricane had torn away most of the safety railings. There was nothing between Sarah and a 30-foot drop into the dark water. But this was also where the water was deepest, and where the most interesting fish would be. She cast her fishing line into the water and sat down on a plastic chair she had brought. The moon was full, giving her enough light to write in her notebook without using her flashlight. She wrote down the time, the temperature, the wind speed, and what phase the moon was in. All of this could affect fish behavior. For the first hour, everything was normal. Sarah caught 2 small fish, measured them, took photos, and threw them back. She saw a school of smaller fish swim by, their scales flashing silver in the moonlight. She wrote everything down in her neat handwriting. At midnight, things started to change. First, all the fish disappeared. 1 minute, Sarah could see them swimming below the pier. The next minute, they were gone. Like something had scared them away. Sarah wrote this down, thinking maybe a bigger predator fish had come into the area. Then she heard the footsteps. They were heavy footsteps, like someone wearing big boots. They were coming from the shore, walking down the pier toward her. This wasn't unusual. Other people fished at night too. But something about these footsteps bothered Sarah. They were too heavy, too slow. And they were wet? Yes, she could hear water squishing with each step. Sarah turned around and called out in a friendly voice. "Hello, beautiful night for fishing." The footsteps stopped. Sarah waited for an answer, but none came. She squinted into the darkness. The nearest working light was far behind her, leaving most of the pier in shadows. She couldn't see anyone. "Is someone there?" She called again, still no answer. Just the sound of waves below. Sarah shrugged and turned back to her fishing. Maybe someone had decided to fish from the middle of the pier instead of coming all the way out. That was fine with her. She preferred to work alone anyway. 5 minutes passed. Then the footsteps started again, closer this time. Much closer. Sarah turned around and saw him. A man was standing about 20 feet away, just at the edge of where her flashlight could reach. He was very tall, maybe 6.5 feet. He was wearing what looked like an old raincoat and rubber boots, the kind fishermen wear. His face was hidden under a hood. "Hi," Sarah said, trying to sound calm, even though her heart was beating fast. "Are you here to fish?" The man didn't answer. He just stood there, watching. Sarah's hand slowly moved to her pocket where she kept her pepper spray. Every instinct in her body was screaming that something was wrong, very wrong. The man took a step forward. Then another. Slow, heavy steps. With each step, water dripped from his clothes and made puddles on the pier. "Sir, please stay back," Sarah said firmly. "I'm working here and I need my space." The man stopped. Then he laughed, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It sounded wet and gurgling, like someone laughing while drowning. And when he laughed, water poured out from under his hood. Not drops of water, a stream of water, like he was full of it. "You shouldn't be here," the man said. His voice was all wrong. It sounded hollow and far away, like he was talking from the bottom of a well. "Not tonight. Not when they're hungry." "Who's hungry?" Sarah asked, gripping her pepper spray tighter. The man tilted his head. More water poured out, splashing on the wooden boards. The smell hit Sarah then. It was the smell of things that had been under water for a long time. Rotten seaweed, dead fish, decay. "They sleep in the deep," the man whispered. "But on nights like this, when the moon is full and the tide is high, they wake up. They come up to feed. And you're standing right where they like to hunt." Sarah stood up slowly, never taking her eyes off the man. "I think I should go now." "Too late," the man said. Then he pulled back his hood. Sarah screamed. The man's face wasn't human. The skin was white and puffy like a drowned corpse. His eyes were huge and round, completely black like a shark's eyes. His mouth was full of barnacles and seaweed, and when he smiled, she could see that his teeth were sharp and pointed like a fish's teeth. "You need to run," the thing that looked like a man said. "Run now. They're already climbing." Sarah heard it then. Wet sounds from below the pier, like hands slapping against wood. Lots of hands. She looked over the edge of the pier where the railing was missing. What she saw made her forget how to breathe. Things were climbing up the pier's legs, dozens of them. They looked human from far away, but up close she could see they were wrong. Their skin was the color of deep ocean water, dark blue-green. Their fingers were too long and had webbing between them. Their faces were the worst part. Human features stretched and twisted into something else, something that belonged in the deep ocean, not on land. And they were looking at her, all of them. Dozens of black eyes focused on her like she was food. Sarah ran. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life. Behind her, she could hear them pulling themselves onto the pier. Their wet feet slapped against the wood as they chased her. Some were running. Others were crawling on all fours like animals. They were making sounds. Not quite human, not quite animal. Clicking and gurgling and hissing. The pier seemed so much longer now. Sarah's flashlight bounced wildly as she ran, making crazy shadows dance around her. She could hear them getting closer. They were fast. Too fast. Something grabbed her ankle. Sarah fell hard, her chin hitting the wooden boards. Stars exploded in her vision. The hand on her ankle was cold and slimy, with a grip like iron. She could feel webbed fingers digging into her skin. Sarah kicked backward as hard as she could. Her foot connected with something soft and wet. There was a screech like an angry dolphin, and the grip loosened. Sarah scrambled to her feet and kept running. She could see her car now. Just 50 more feet, but they were right behind her. She could feel their cold breath on her neck, smell their rotten ocean stench. Sarah's hand was already pulling out her car keys as she ran. She pressed the unlock button over and over. The car's lights flashed welcomingly. 20 feet, 10 feet, 5. Sarah yanked the door open and threw herself inside. She slammed the door just as something hit the window. She looked and saw one of those things pressed against the glass, its black eyes staring at her, its webbed hand leaving slimy prints on her window. Sarah started the car and floored it. Gravel flew everywhere as she spun out of the parking lot. In her mirrors, She could see them standing in the road, watching her go. Dozens of them, all perfectly still, all staring. Sarah drove straight to the police station. But what could she say? Sea monsters attacked me? The officer on duty looked at her like she was crazy or on drugs. He wrote down her report, but she could tell he didn't believe a word. But Sarah had to know what she had seen. She spent the next weeks researching everything about Blackwood Pier. What she found made her wish she had never gone there. The pier was built in 1894, right on top of where a ship had sunk 2 years earlier. The ship was called the Mary Catherine, and it had been carrying 43 passengers and crew. Everyone on board drowned when the ship hit rocks during a storm. Their bodies were never found. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was what Sarah found in the town's historical records. After the ship sank, fishermen started reporting strange things. Voices calling from the water at night, pale figures seen swimming in the waves, fish with human eyes caught in nets. The town leaders decided to build the pier at that exact spot. They said it was to honor the dead, but Sarah found the real reason in an old diary from one of the town founders. He wrote that they made a deal with the things in the water. The pier would be a feeding spot. In exchange, the creatures would leave the town's fishermen alone. For over 100 years, people had been disappearing from Blackwood Pier. The police always said they fell and drowned. But now Sarah knew the truth. They didn't fall. They were taken, pulled down by things that used to be human, but had been changed by years in the dark, cold ocean. Sarah left North Carolina the next week. She transferred to a college in Colorado, far from any ocean. She changed her major from marine biology to forestry. She never wanted to study the ocean again. But sometimes, when it rains, she thinks about Blackwood Pier, about those creatures, about how many piers and docks around the world might have similar secrets, how many drowning victims were actually pulled under by webbed hands. And late at night, when she's trying to sleep, she remembers what the first creature said to her. They sleep in the deep. If those things were the ones sleeping, what happens when the things that are already awake decide to hunt? Sarah doesn't want to know. She just wants to forget she ever saw Blackwood Pier. But you don't forget black eyes like that. You don't forget the feeling of webbed fingers on your ankle. And you definitely don't forget the sound of dozens of wet feet chasing you through the darkness. Story 3. The Ice Fisherman's Nightmare. Marcus Petrov loved winter. While other people complained about the cold and the snow, Marcus celebrated it, because winter meant ice fishing season, and ice fishing was Marcus's favorite thing in the whole world. Marcus was 58 years old and had been ice fishing since he was 6. His grandfather had taught him on a small lake in Minnesota. He still remembered his first fish, a tiny perch that his grandfather said was the most beautiful fish he'd ever seen. From that day on, Marcus was hooked. Every winter, Marcus would spend every weekend on the frozen lakes of Minnesota. He had all the best equipment, a portable shelter that was warm and comfortable, a gas-powered auger that could drill through 3 feet of ice in seconds, and the best fishing rods money could buy. His wife joked that he loved his ice fishing gear more than he loved her. Marcus would laugh, but secretly he wondered if she might be right. In January 2020, Marcus decided to try a new lake. He had heard about it from an old man at the bait shop. The old man had whispered about a lake 3 hours north of the city where the fish were as big as dogs and stupid enough to bite anything. But then the old man had grabbed Marcus's arm and said something strange. Don't go there alone, and whatever you do, don't stay after dark. The lake doesn't like visitors after dark. Marcus had laughed it off. Old fishermen were always telling scary stories about lakes and rivers. It was part of the culture. He thanked the old man for the tip and drove home to pack his gear. That weekend, Marcus loaded his truck and headed north. The drive took him through thick forests and past frozen swamps. The further north he went, the fewer houses he saw. By the time he reached the lake, he hadn't seen another car for an hour. The lake was beautiful. It was about a mile across, surrounded by tall pine trees heavy with snow. The ice was perfect, clear and thick, at least 2 feet deep. Marcus could see fish swimming below the ice, dark shapes moving in the green water. Marcus drove his truck onto the ice. This was normal for ice fishing. The ice was so thick it could hold 10 trucks. He drove out to the middle of the lake, about half a mile from shore. This is where the big fish would be, in the deep water. Setting up his shelter took about an hour. First, he used his auger to drill 6 holes in the ice. The auger screamed as it chewed through the frozen water, sending chips of ice flying. Each hole was 8 inches wide, perfect for pulling up big fish. Then he set up his portable shelter. It was like a small tent, but insulated to keep the heat in. Inside, he had a comfortable chair, a small heater that ran on propane, and holders for all his fishing rods. He even had a small TV that ran on batteries, though the reception out here was terrible. By noon, Marcus was all set up. He had lines in 4 of the 6 holes, each one baited with minnows he had bought from the bait shop. He poured himself coffee from his thermos and settled in to wait. The first day was perfect. The fish were biting like crazy. Marcus caught 10 big walleye and a northern pike that must have weighed 20 pounds. It fought for 15 minutes before Marcus could pull it through the hole. He took photos of each fish before putting them in his cooler. His wife would be happy. She loved fresh walleye for dinner. As the sun set, Marcus cooked himself dinner on his portable stove. Just a simple meal of beans and hot dogs, but it tasted like heaven after a day of fishing. He watched the sun paint the sky orange and pink through his shelter's window. Life was good. Marcus decided to sleep in his shelter that night. He had a good sleeping bag rated for 40 below zero. The heater would keep the shelter warm enough, and this way, he could start fishing again at first light. He went to sleep around 9 o'clock, tired from the day's fishing. The last thing he heard was the ice creaking and groaning beneath him. This was normal. Ice always made sounds as it shifted and settled. It was actually peaceful, like the lake was singing him to sleep. Marcus woke up at midnight to a different sound. Knock, knock, knock. It was coming from below, from under the ice. Marcus sat up in his sleeping bag, listening. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, like someone knocking on a door. What the hell? Marcus muttered. He grabbed his flashlight and looked down one of the holes. The water was dark, but he could see his fishing line going down into the depths. Nothing strange. The knocking stopped. Marcus was about to go back to sleep when he heard something that made his blood freeze. A voice. Muffled by water and ice, but definitely a voice. And it was saying his name. Marcus. Marcus. Let me in. Marcus jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. That was impossible. There was no one under the ice. There couldn't be. Marcus, I'm so cold. Please let me in. The voice was coming from all 6 holes now. Different voices. Men, women, even children. All begging to be let in. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and looked down each hole. In the first 5, he saw nothing but dark water, but in the 6th hole, he saw something that made him scream. A face was looking up at him from under the water. A human face, pale and bloated, with blue lips and milky white eyes. The mouth was moving, forming words. Help me, Marcus. Pull me up. Marcus fell backward, scrambling away from the hole. This was impossible. No one could survive under the ice. The water was barely above freezing. Any person down there would be dead in minutes, but the face was still there. And now there were more faces in the other holes, all looking up at him, all moving their mouths, all asking to be pulled up. We've been waiting for you, Marcus, one of them said, its voice bubbling up through the water. We've been so lonely down here, so cold and lonely. Marcus noticed something that made everything worse. The faces looked familiar. He recognized some of them from missing person posters he had seen over the years. Fishermen who had fallen through the ice and never been found. You're dead, Marcus said, his voice shaking. You're all dead. Death is different here, a child's voice said from one of the holes. The lake keeps us, preserves us. We're still aware, still hungry, still so very cold. The knocking started again, but now it was coming from everywhere. The entire shelter was shaking. Whatever was under the ice was pounding to get through. Marcus grabbed his coat and ran outside. What he saw made him fall to his knees. The ice around his shelter was cracking. But not normal cracks. These cracks formed letters, words, a message. Join us. Marcus ran for his truck. But when he got there, he found that the ice around it had melted. The truck was sitting in a pool of water, slowly sinking. As he watched, it tilted forward and slipped through the ice with a huge splash. Marcus was trapped on the ice, half a mile from shore, with those things trying to break through. The ice beneath his feet was getting thinner. He could see through it now, and what he saw made him want to scream. Dozens of bodies were pressed against the underside of the ice. All of them were looking at him. All of them were smiling with blue, frozen lips. Marcus ran toward shore, but with each step, the ice got thinner. Water started seeping through cracks. His boots were soaking wet and freezing. He could feel the cold climbing up his legs like icy hands. Behind him, he heard the ice breaking. Huge chunks were falling into the dark water. He glanced back and saw them climbing out. The dead fishermen. Their bodies were stiff and moved in jerky, unnatural ways. Ice had formed in their hair and on their clothes. Their eyes were white with frost, but they were fast. So fast. Marcus ran harder than he had ever run in his life. His chest felt like it was going to explode. His legs were numb from the cold. But he kept running because stopping meant joining them in the frozen water forever. The shore was so close. Just 50 feet, 30 feet, 10 feet. Marcus threw himself onto solid ground just as the ice behind him completely collapsed. He looked back and saw them standing at the edge of the water. Dozens of frozen corpses, all watching him with those milky eyes. "You'll be back," one of them said. "The lake always calls its fishermen home." Then they sank back into the water and disappeared. Marcus crawled to the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver took him to the hospital, where he was treated for hypothermia and frostbite. He lost 2 toes to the cold. When the police went to investigate, they found Marcus's shelter sitting on perfect, unbroken ice. His truck was parked right where he said it had sunk. There was no sign that anything unusual had happened, but Marcus knew what he had seen. He researched the lake and found the horrible truth. Over the past 60 years, 43 people had drowned in that lake. All ice fishermen. All their bodies never recovered. The lake was over 300 feet deep in some places. The bottom was so cold that bodies would be perfectly preserved. They would never decompose. They would just stay down there forever, in the dark and cold. But that didn't explain how they could move, how they could talk, how they could try to pull him down with them. Marcus never went ice fishing again. He sold all his equipment and moved to Florida, where the lakes never freeze. But even in the heat of the Florida sun, he sometimes wakes up shivering, feeling cold water on his feet. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, he can hear them knocking. Knock. 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 Like they're right outside his door. Like they followed him all the way from that frozen lake. Marcus knows that one day they'll find a way to take him back. The lake wants what it's owed. And Marcus escaped when he should have joined the others under the ice. He's living on borrowed time, and borrowed time always runs out. Story 4. The Deep Sea Charter. Captain Jimmy Rodriguez had been running fishing charters out of the Florida Keys for 15 years. He had seen everything the ocean could throw at him. Storms that came out of nowhere, sharks that were way too interested in his boat, and tourists who got seasick before they even left the dock. But Jimmy loved his job. He loved being on the water. He loved the look on people's faces when they caught their first big fish. Jimmy's boat was called the Salty Dream. She was a beautiful 40-foot fishing boat with all the best equipment. She could handle rough seas and had enough power to fight the biggest fish in the ocean. Jimmy was proud of his boat. He treated her better than most people treat their houses. On a Saturday morning in August 2022, Jimmy prepared for what should have been a normal charter. 6 tourists had booked a full day of deep-sea fishing. There was the Johnson family from Ohio, Mom, Dad, and 2 teenage kids who had never seen the ocean before today. And there was a young couple from New York, celebrating their first anniversary. They all showed up at the dock at 6 in the morning. excited and ready for adventure. The kids were taking pictures of everything. The couple was holding hands and smiling. It was going to be a good day. Jimmy gave them the usual safety talk. Where the life jackets were, how to use the radio, what to do if someone fell overboard. Then he showed them how to use the fishing rods and how to fight a big fish. The kids listened with wide eyes, imagining themselves catching a monster fish. They left the dock as the sun was coming up, painting the sky beautiful colors. The water was calm, like glass. Jimmy could see dolphins playing in the distance. Flying fish jumped out of the water and glided beside the boat. The tourists were amazed by everything. The trip to the deep water took about 2 hours. Jimmy knew a special spot where the ocean floor dropped off into a deep canyon. This is where the big fish hunted: marlin, tuna, maybe even a sailfish if they were lucky. As they got further from shore, the water changed color. Near the beach, it was light blue-green, but out here it was dark blue, almost black. This was real ocean. Deep ocean. The kind of ocean where you couldn't see the bottom. They reached Jimmy's spot around 8:30. The depth finder showed they were over the canyon. 2,000 feet of water below them. That's deeper than the Empire State Building is tall. When Jimmy told the tourists this, the kids looked a little nervous. "Don't worry," Jimmy said with a smile. "The fish we want are near the surface. We won't be dealing with anything from the deep." He would later regret saying those words. Jimmy set up 6 fishing rods with different baits. Some had small fish, some had squid. One had a colorful lure that supposedly drove marlin crazy. He showed everyone how to watch their rod for signs of a bite. For the first hour, the fishing was slow. They caught a few small tuna, which Jimmy said they could cook for lunch. The kids were thrilled to catch anything. The couple took 1,000,000 photos. Then Jimmy noticed something weird on his depth finder. The screen showed something huge rising from the canyon. It was moving fast, coming straight up from 2,000 feet. Jimmy had seen whales on his depth finder before, but they didn't move like this. This thing was coming up like a rocket. "What's that?" asked Mr. Johnson, looking at the screen. "Probably just a malfunction," Jimmy said, but he was worried. In 15 years, he had never seen anything move that fast underwater. The thing on the screen kept rising. 1,000 feet, 800 feet, 600 feet, 400 feet. Then all 6 fishing rods bent at the same time. The reels screamed as line poured out. Everyone grabbed a rod, thinking they had hit the jackpot. 6 fish at once. The kids were yelling with excitement. The couple was laughing, but Jimmy knew something was wrong. All 6 lines were running in the exact same direction, straight down. And they were running too fast. Whatever had grabbed the lines was powerful, very powerful. "Should we try to reel them in?" Mrs. Johnson asked. Before Jimmy could answer, all 6 lines went slack, completely slack. Jimmy reeled in his line and found it had been cut, not broken, cut. The line looked like someone had taken scissors to it. He checked the other lines, all cut in the exact same way. "What could do that?" the husband from New York asked. Jimmy didn't answer because he didn't know. But he had a bad feeling, a very bad feeling. "Maybe we should try a different spot," he said. But before he could start the engine, the water around the boat began to change. It was turning black, not the normal dark blue of deep water, but actual black, like ink. The tourists pressed against the windows, trying to see what was happening. The black water spread out from directly under the boat, creating a perfect circle about 100 feet across. It looked like someone had poured oil on the water, but Jimmy could tell it wasn't oil. It was something else, something from below. "Captain, what's happening?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice shaking. "Everyone get inside the cabin," Jimmy ordered. "Now." They all crowded into the cabin, faces pressed against the windows. The black water was perfectly still, like a dark mirror. The normal ocean waves stopped at its edge, as if something was holding the water in place. Then the boat's engine died. Jimmy tried to restart it. Nothing. He checked the battery, fully charged. He checked the fuel, full tank. Everything should have been working, but the engine was completely dead. They were trapped in the middle of this black pool, with no way to escape. That's when things started coming up from the water. At first, it was just bubbles. Thousands and thousands of bubbles, making the black water foam and hiss. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds. The windows of the cabin fogged up from the sudden cold. Then came the fish. But calling them fish wasn't really right. They were wrong, twisted. Some had human-like eyes that stared at the boat. Others had too many fins or fins in the wrong places. One fish that floated past had teeth growing on the outside of its body like spikes. The kids were crying now. The adults were trying to stay calm. But Jimmy could see the fear in their eyes. "It's okay," Jimmy lied. "This is just a natural phenomenon. Like red tide, but different. It'll pass." Then something hit the boat from below. The impact was so hard that everyone fell to the floor. Coffee cups smashed. Fishing rods went flying. The boat lifted completely out of the water for a second, then crashed back down. "What was that?" Mr. Johnson yelled. Jimmy looked out the window and wished he hadn't. Something was rising from the center of the black water. At first, Jimmy thought it was a whale, but as it got closer to the surface, he realized it was something else, something that shouldn't exist. It was flesh, but not organized like any animal Jimmy knew. It was like someone had taken 100 different sea creatures and melted them together. There were tentacles from octopi, but they were growing out of what looked like a shark's body. There were crab claws attached to something that might have been a jellyfish. Eyes, dozens of eyes from different creatures, dotted its surface, all looking in different directions. But the worst part was that it was still growing. More flesh kept rising from the water. The thing was massive, at least 50 feet across and getting bigger. The smell hit them next. Even inside the sealed cabin, the stench got through. It was the smell of rotting fish mixed with something chemical, something that burned the inside of their noses. One of the thing's many mouths opened, revealing rows of teeth from different animals, shark teeth, barracuda teeth, and things that looked almost human. From deep inside, the creature came a sound that wasn't quite a roar, wasn't quite a scream, but something in between. Then Jimmy heard something that made his skin crawl. Words. The thing was trying to speak. Join us. Become one with the deep. The words came from multiple mouths, creating a horrible chorus. Some mouths spoke in English, others in languages Jimmy didn't recognize, and some just made sounds that hurt to hear. The teenager girl screamed and fainted. Her mother caught her before she hit the floor. Jimmy knew they had seconds before this thing attacked the boat. He grabbed a flare gun from the emergency kit and kicked open the cabin door. "Stay inside," he yelled to the others. Jimmy ran to the deck and fired the flare directly at the creature's largest eye cluster. The flare exploded in a shower of sparks and burning chemicals. The creature recoiled, all its mouth screaming at once. The sound was so loud that Jimmy's ears started bleeding, but it worked. The black water began to recede. The creature started sinking back into the depths, and miraculously, the boat's engine roared back to life. Jimmy didn't waste a second. He ran to the controls and slammed the throttle forward. The boat shot forward, nearly throwing him off balance. Behind them, the creature was still sinking, but tentacles the size of telephone poles were reaching for the boat. One tentacle came within inches of the stern before falling back into the water. Jimmy kept the throttle at maximum speed, not caring that he was pushing the engine too hard. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The engine temperature gauge went into the red zone, but he didn't slow down. They were a mile away when Jimmy finally looked back. The black water was gone. The ocean looked normal. It was like nothing had happened. The tourists were in shock. The kids were still crying. The adults were pale and shaking. No one spoke for the entire trip back to the dock. When they arrived, things got even stranger. Men in black suits were waiting at the dock. They weren't police or Coast Guard. They didn't identify themselves. They took everyone's phones and cameras. They made everyone sign papers. Legal documents that said they couldn't talk about what they had seen. The official story, they were told, was that they had encountered a toxic algae bloom that caused hallucinations. The boat had mechanical problems, nothing more. If anyone said otherwise, they would be arrested for causing public panic. One of the men pulled Jimmy aside and said something that still haunts him. "You're lucky, Captain. Most boats that encounter a convergence don't come back. The deep ocean has things in it that we're still trying to understand. Things that shouldn't exist but do. Stay in shallow water from now on, and forget what you saw." But how could Jimmy forget? How could he forget those dozens of eyes all looking at him? How could he forget the smell, the sound, the feeling of something massive and wrong rising from the deep? Jimmy sold his charter business the next week. He sold his boat. He moved to Kansas, about as far from the ocean as you could get in America. But sometimes, late at night, he dreams about that thing in the black water. And in his dreams it speaks to him. "We're still here, Jimmy. Still waiting. The ocean is patient, and one day, everyone will join us in the deep. Everyone will become part of the convergence." Jimmy wakes up screaming from these dreams, and sometimes, just sometimes, he wakes up with seawater in his lungs. Story 5. The River at Night. Robert was a good father. He worked hard at his job as an accountant, went to all his son Tyler's baseball games, and helped with homework every night. But his favorite thing was the fishing trips he took with Tyler every summer. Just the two of them, camping by a river, catching fish, and talking about life. Tyler was 14 now, in that difficult age where kids start pulling away from their parents. He was more interested in video games and his phone than spending time with his dad. But the fishing trip was different. Out in nature, with no internet and no distractions, Tyler became a kid again. He laughed at his dad's bad jokes, got excited about catching fish, and actually talked about his feelings. That's why Robert was so excited about their trip in July 2023. He had found a new place, the Blackwater River in Tennessee. The website said it had the best catfish in the state and primitive camping that would make you feel like you were a million miles from civilization. They drove down on a Friday, the truck loaded with camping gear, fishing equipment, and enough food for 3 days. Tyler complained for the first hour about missing a party with his friends, but by the time they reached the mountains, he was smiling and pointing out cool things he saw. The Blackwater River was hard to find. They had to drive down a dirt road for 5 miles, following hand-painted signs that looked like they were 50 years old. The road got narrower and rougher the further they went. Tree branches scraped against the truck. Robert started to wonder if they were lost. Then they saw the river. It was beautiful. The water was dark, that's why they called it Blackwater, but clear. You could see fish swimming in the deeper pools. The river was about 30 feet wide, with rocky shores and deep pools perfect for catfish. They found a camping spot on a flat area next to the river. It was perfect. Close enough to the water for easy fishing, but high enough that they wouldn't get flooded if it rained. Big trees provided shade, and there was a ring of rocks from previous campers' fires. As they set up the tent, Tyler found something carved into a tree. It was a warning, carved deep into the bark. "Don't fish after dark." "That's creepy," Tyler said. Robert laughed. Probably just someone trying to scare other fishermen away from the good spots. "Catfish bite best at night. That's when we'll catch the big ones." They spent the afternoon setting up camp and fishing from the shore. They caught a few small fish. Nothing special, but enough to make them excited for the night fishing. As the sun went down, they cooked hot dogs over the fire, and Robert told stories about fishing with his own dad. Around 9 o'clock, they got their fishing gear ready for night fishing. Robert had brought special equipment, glow-in-the-dark bobbers so they could see when they had a bite, and strong line in case they hooked a big catfish. He also had stink bait, which smelled terrible but drove catfish crazy. They set up their rods on the shore, cast their lines into a deep pool, and sat in their camping chairs to wait. The fire crackled behind them, providing light and keeping the mosquitoes away. The stars were incredible out here, with no city lights to hide them. For the first hour, everything was perfect. They caught 2 nice-sized catfish, which they put in a bucket to cook for breakfast. Tyler was having a great time, laughing and joking like he used to when he was younger. Then they heard voices coming from upriver. At first, Robert thought it was other campers, but there was something wrong with the voices. They were too flat, too emotionless, and they were singing something. Not quite a song, more like a chant. Lights appeared through the trees. Not flashlights. These lights were orange and flickering like torches. 3 men emerged from the darkness. They were carrying old-fashioned lanterns and fishing poles that looked like they were from 100 years ago. Their clothes were strange, too. Old canvas pants and shirts that looked handmade. The men stopped about 30 feet away. Robert could see their faces in the lantern light, and something about them made his stomach tight with fear. Their eyes were wrong, too bright, like they were reflecting the light instead of absorbing it. "Evening," the tallest man said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. "Nice night for fishing." "Yes, it is," Robert said carefully. Something about these men made him want to grab Tyler and run, but he tried to stay calm. "You folks from around here?" the man asked. "No, just visiting. Camping for the weekend." The 3 men looked at each other and smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "River's dangerous at night," the tall man said. "Things in the water that ain't fish. Smart folks stay away after dark." "We'll be careful," Robert said. He put his hand on Tyler's shoulder, ready to leave if necessary. The men set up their fishing equipment a little ways downstream. But Robert noticed they weren't really fishing. They put lines in the water but never checked them, never changed bait. They just sat there, watching Robert and Tyler. Tyler moved closer to his dad. "I don't like those guys," he whispered. "Me neither," Robert whispered back. "Let's pack up." As they started reeling in their lines, one of the men called out, "Leaving so soon? Night's just getting started." "My son's tired," Robert said. "We're heading back to camp." "Camp's that way," the man said, pointing into the dark forest in the opposite direction from their tent. "No, it's this way," Robert said, pointing toward their actual camp. The 3 men stood up. They moved too quickly, too smoothly, like they were gliding instead of walking. "No," the tall man said. "You want to go that way? Trust us." Robert's hand went to the knife on his belt. "We're fine, thanks." The men spread out, forming a half circle that blocked the path to their camp. Their eyes were glowing now, actually glowing like an animal's eyes in headlights. "The river needs feeding," one of them said. "It's been so hungry, so very hungry. Every summer people come," another said. "Every summer, some stay forever." Robert understood then. These weren't normal men. Maybe they had been once, but not anymore. Something had changed them, twisted them into something else. "Tyler," Robert said quietly. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back, don't stop. Just run to the truck." "Dad, I'm scared." "I know."
"Me too, but we're going to be okay." The tall man laughed.
It was a sound like water gurgling down a drain. "You can't run from the river. The river is everywhere. In the ground, in the trees, in the air you breathe. You've been drinking it, haven't you? From your water bottles? It's already inside you." Robert felt sick. They had filled their water bottles from the river, after purifying it with tablets. But what if the tablets didn't work on whatever was in this water? "Run!" Robert yelled, pushing Tyler toward the forest. They ran. Behind them, the men laughed and gave chase. But they didn't run like normal people. Robert could hear them moving through the forest, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on all 4s, sometimes seeming to swing from the trees. The darkness was complete under the trees. Robert could barely see where he was going. Branches tore at his face and clothes. Tyler was crying, but he kept running. Something grabbed Robert's ankle, and he went down hard. He rolled over and saw one of the men crouched over him. But the man's face was changing. The skin was rippling, becoming scaled like a fish. The eyes were moving apart, sliding to the sides of his head. The mouth was getting wider, showing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Robert kicked the thing in the face as hard as he could. It screeched and let go. Robert scrambled to his feet and kept running. They burst out of the forest onto the dirt road where they had parked the truck. But the truck was different. It was covered in river weeds and mud, like it had been underwater. The windows were smashed. The tires were flat. "No, no, no," Robert yelled. The 3 things that used to be men emerged from the forest. They weren't pretending to be human anymore. Their bodies were wrong. Too long, too flexible, covered in scales and slime. Their faces were a horrible mix of human and fish features. "The river always wins," one of them said, its voice bubbling like it was talking underwater. "You can join us willingly, or we can drag you in. Either way, You become part of the river. Robert pulled Tyler behind him and drew his knife. It seemed pathetically small against these creatures, but it was all he had. "Please," he said, "let my son go. Take me, but let him go." The creatures laughed. "The river doesn't make deals. The river takes what it wants." They started moving closer, spreading out to surround Robert and Tyler. Their movements were hypnotic, like water flowing. Robert found it hard to focus on them. They seemed to shift and change, never quite solid. Then Tyler did something that saved their lives. He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it directly at the creatures. The bright LED light hit them and they screamed, covering their fish-like eyes. Their skin started steaming where the light touched it. "The light hurts them," Tyler yelled. Robert pulled out his own phone and turned on the flashlight. Together, they swept the beams across the creatures, driving them back. The things howled and writhed, their skin bubbling and peeling. "Run for the road," Robert yelled. They ran down the dirt road, using their phones to light the way. Behind them, they could hear the creatures following, but staying out of the direct light. The batteries on their phones were draining fast. They had maybe 10 minutes before the lights died. They ran for 5 miles. 5 miles of terror, hearing those things calling to them from the darkness, seeing eyes glowing in the forest on either side of the road. Sometimes the creatures would try to get ahead of them, but the phone lights kept them back. Finally, they saw lights ahead. Real lights, a gas station at the main road. They burst into the gas station, startling the teenage clerk. Robert grabbed the store phone and called 911, reporting that they had been attacked. The police arrived in 10 minutes. Robert tried to explain what had happened, but the cops looked at him like he was crazy. They drove Robert and Tyler back to their campsite, hands on their guns, clearly thinking Robert was the dangerous one. But when they got to the campsite, everything was different. The truck was fine. No damage, no river weeds. Their camping gear was untouched. There was no sign of the 3 men or any struggle. The police decided Robert had been drinking and made up the story. They gave him a warning and left. But Tyler had taken pictures with his phone. When they looked at them later, safe in a motel room, the pictures showed the truth. Blurry images of things that weren't quite human, with glowing eyes and too many teeth. They drove home the next morning and never talked about what happened. But Robert did research on the Blackwater River. What he found terrified him. The river had a dark history. In the 1920s, a small town on the river had disappeared overnight. All 120 residents just vanished. The only clue was a note left in the church. "The river called us home." Since then, people had been disappearing from the Blackwater River regularly. Usually fishermen or campers. Their bodies were never found. The locals avoided the river, especially at night. They said the river was cursed, that it was alive somehow and hungry. Some people claimed to see the missing people sometimes fishing at night. But they weren't human anymore. They had become part of the river, changed into something that lived between land and water. Robert and Tyler never went fishing again. They never went camping again. They stayed away from rivers, lakes, even large swimming pools. But sometimes on rainy nights they hear things. Voices in the rain calling them, telling them the river misses them, telling them to come back. And sometimes Robert wakes up with river water in his lungs, coughing and gasping. The doctor says it's just fluid from allergies. But Robert knows better. The river marked them that night. It tasted them. And someday, somehow, it will call them back. Because the river is patient. And the river never forgets. So there you have it. 5 true stories that prove fishing isn't always the peaceful hobby we think it is. 5 regular people who went looking for fish and found nightmares instead. Think about it. Every time someone goes fishing and doesn't come back, we assume they drowned. It's an accident, we say. They fell in the water. They had a heart attack. Their boat sank. But what if that's not always true? What if sometimes, just sometimes, something pulls them in? Something takes them? Something changes them into something else? The water covers most of our planet, but we've explored less than 5% of the ocean. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the bottom of our own seas. What's down there in the dark? What's been down there since before humans existed? And what happens when we accidentally disturb it? Every lake has its deep spots where the sun never reaches. Every river has its dark pools where the water is still and strange. Every ocean has its trenches that go down for miles into complete darkness. And in all these places, things live. Things we don't understand. Things we don't want to understand. The next time you go fishing, remember these stories. When you're sitting by the water, waiting for a bite, and you feel like something is watching you. Maybe something is. When you hear a splash that's too big to be a normal fish, maybe it isn't a fish at all. When other fishermen warn you about certain spots or certain times, maybe you should listen, because the water remembers everything. Every person who ever drowned, every ship that ever sank, every secret that was ever thrown into the deep. It's all still there, waiting in the dark. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, when the moon is full or the tide is high or the fog rolls in thick, the water gives up its secrets. But by then it's usually too late, so be careful out there. Watch the water. Listen to the locals, and if something doesn't feel right, if your instincts tell you to leave, leave. Don't be brave. Don't be curious. Just get away from the water as fast as you can. Because the water is patient. The water is hungry. And the water never ever forgets. Sweet dreams, and remember, maybe it's safer to just buy your fish at the store.